book of John, or the Gospel of John, I should say, chapter 4. I was about to say, this doesn't look like John, it's Matthew. And I'll, of course, have, as always, the verses up there, but if you want to read along, you can. In John chapter 4, we see the story of the Samaritan woman. And that's not the story we're going to be talking about today, but it's a little bit of a context. All right, today the goal is to show that everyone should trust in Jesus, not in his abilities, for these three reasons. And so in John chapter 4, the last story in John chapter 4, there's this nobleman. In King James Version, it refers to him as a nobleman. The word means royal, so it could be a royal official. So some translations say official, some translations say nobleman, but in this case, I just referred to him as the official. The official believed that Jesus could heal. Second, the official's faith was incomplete. And third, the official's faith grew. So those are the 3 points that we're going to go throughout this lesson, throughout this sermon. But a little bit of a context, the Samaritans' acceptance. So you remember the Samaritans, these were people who were not liked by the Jews, and they didn't like the Jews either. It's kind of confusing if they were really related to the Jews or not. Sometimes they would associate themselves and say, yeah, we're Jewish, whenever it would benefit them. And other times they would say, no, we're not Jewish, whenever the Jews were being persecuted. So they didn't like each other. And the Jews just thought they were maybe half-caste, or they did have the Bible, but they just had the first 5 books, and it was a little different than the Jewish 5 books. And they had their own kind of their temple or tabernacle. So that's why when you see the Samaritan woman saying, we worship here, but the Jews worship in Jerusalem, what's the real place to worship? So there was a lot of hostility between the Samaritans and the Jewish people. But in spite of that, Jesus crossed these cultural barriers in order to get to the Samaritan woman. And he doesn't perform any miracles or anything like that, right? He doesn't heal anybody, he doesn't raise anyone from the dead, he doesn't cast out any demons, he just talks to her. Now, you could say he used his omniscience to know things about her that she wouldn't have known, or that he shouldn't have known, so that was somewhat miraculous. But read with me here, after the woman, she starts to believe in Jesus, she goes to the city and says, is this the Messiah, right? Is this the one we're waiting for? And many of the Samaritans of that city believed on him for the sayings of the woman, which testified, he told me all that ever I did. So when the Samaritans were come unto him, they besought him that he would tarry with them, and he abode there 2 days, right? So some of them are kind of wondering, is she telling the truth? Who is this guy? They want to get to know him a little bit more. And many more believed because of his own word, and said unto the woman, now we believe, not because of thy sayings, for we have heard him ourselves, and know that this is indeed the Christ, right? The Messiah, the Savior of the world. Now this is, of course, not random, but fantastic, because if you read the book of John, at the very end, or John chapter 20, verse, I believe, 30 and 31, it talks about how Jesus did many other signs in his ministry. He says, but these are written. What are these? The signs. The word sign there, it's referring to his miraculous works, things that were signs of his divinity, that he was more than just a man, that he was God in the form of man. So when he would do these miracles, John is trying to emphasize this is God that we're seeing right here, that you're reading about right here. So he did all these different miraculous signs to show the world who he was. But when it comes to the story of the Samaritan woman, he doesn't do a single sign. They believed him not because of the signs, but because of his word. They trusted in his word. So it's a very, I hate to say random, but very surprising story in the book of John. But if we go on in the next story, it says right after this, now after 2 days he departed thence and went into Galilee. For Jesus himself testified that a prophet hath no honor in his own country. Now one thing I want to emphasize here, John is referencing Jesus. He's not quoting Jesus in the sense that he's not saying Jesus said this right now. He's saying that Jesus has said this already, or Jesus said this in the past at some point. His point is he's trying to emphasize the principle that Jesus has already said. Now, when Jesus said this statement, when he said a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, he was in Nazareth, right? The place where he kind of grew up. Now, he is not in Nazareth right now. So again, John is not quoting him as saying this is what he said right now. He's saying this is something that he's already said. So the question becomes, why is John referencing this? He's leaving Samaria, which is not the home, it's part of the country of Israel, but it's not really what would be considered the home country of Jesus. So he's departing the Samaria and going to Galilee, which Nazareth is in Galilee. For Jesus himself testified that a prophet had no honor in his own country. And it's a little confusing. And I've read lots of different perspectives on this, and everyone seems to be confused about this. It may be that he's leaving Judea. Before he went to Samaria, stayed there for a couple days, he was leaving Jerusalem, right? In fact, they'll reference that in a second. So it's possible that when John is talking about his home country, he's talking about his home country in the sense of the capital of his country, Jerusalem, or even Bethlehem, which was also in Judea. But I believe that John is trying to hint to us that not Jerusalem or Judea, but rather Galilee is going to be a place where Jesus is not honored, at least not to the extent that you would hope he would be. And this becomes very surprising because then when he was coming to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things that he had did at Jerusalem at the feast, for they also went unto the feast. So they were in Jerusalem, right? They had gone to one of the festivals, one of the feasts, and they had seen all these signs and wonders that Jesus did. And by the way, John does not even mention what they were. If you read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what you'll find is the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar to one another. They talk a lot about the same stories, now from different perspectives, different emphasis, but very similar to one another. John was like, I'm not going to repeat that, right? I'm going to tell my own story. Now, of course, he still talks about Jesus' death and resurrection, and I think one of the only miracles that is found in all four Gospels, because John is so different, is the feeding of the 5,000. Other than that, most of the miracles that are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not found in John, and vice versa. Now, John, even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each of them mention dozens of different miracles that Jesus did, John's like, I'm just going to focus on around 6 to 8 miracles, and he calls them signs. And the question becomes, why did he do this if he says later on, these signs have been written to you so that you might believe? Wouldn't he want to list all the signs that Jesus did? Well, you see, he doesn't need to list all of them. He only needs to list one of each. So he doesn't list 3 or 4 times that Jesus healed the blind. He only mentions it one time. He doesn't mention every time Jesus healed a paralyzed person. He only mentions it one time. He doesn't mention every time that Jesus rose someone from the dead, which happened multiple times. He only mentions it one time because he wants each of these signs to represent something about Jesus, right? Turning water into wine represents Jesus' power over creation, right? In the beginning of John, he talks just like in Genesis. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. He later goes on to say the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. And he's talking about Jesus. Jesus, he says nothing was created without him. He was the creator. So when John says the first sign, turning water into wine, he's showing the world that Jesus has power over creation. We can think of another story very similar when Satan, or not very similar, but similar concept. Satan, he's trying to tempt Jesus, right? And he says, if you were really the Son of God, what could you do, right? You could turn a stone into bread. So what does John say? He said he turned water into wine, right? He had power over creation. So even though Jesus does not turn a stone into bread because that wasn't his purpose, that wasn't what he was there for, did he have the power to do it? Absolutely, but he didn't do it because that's not what the lesson was for that moment. But John is going to talk about these different signs throughout the gospel. And he's going to be very nitpicky, right? He's going to pick very specific ones. So there were apparently lots of signs that happened in Jerusalem that he doesn't mention. You can think of John 3:16. Jesus, of course, is talking to Nicodemus. But Nicodemus came to him and he said, I know you're from God. For who can do these signs except he be from God? Well, Jesus in John, is only recorded to have done one sign before that, and that wasn't even in Jerusalem. So we know that there were other things going on that John does not mention. He's only mentioning some of them. So the people of Galilee, apparently they were in Jerusalem and they saw these many signs that Jesus had done, and they were celebrating him coming. They're thinking, wow, look at this. We have Jesus, this great miracle worker, coming here. But why then does John say, for Jesus himself testified that a prophet had no honor in his own country? is it possible that John is trying to hint to the readers that yes, they received him, but not fully? They received him as a miracle worker, but not as a savior. Because remember where he just came from, Samaria, where they received him not because they saw these many signs, but because of his word. They trusted his word rather than having him prove himself by showing them signs. All right, the official believed Jesus could heal. So Jesus came again into Cana of Galilee, where he made the water wine. And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. Capernaum, that would have been where Peter probably lived. We know his mother-in-law was there. Jesus healed her there. It became kind of a base of operation for Jesus, that particular spot. But he's not even there. He's in Cana, which is about 16 to 20 miles away, depending on where you start your journey. And this nobleman, he hears about Jesus. Remember, we were just told that many of the people in Galilee, that's the region, Cana, Nazareth, Capernaum, all that places would have been in that general region. And the people of Galilee, they heard that Jesus was there and they celebrated, they received him. And this person had likely also heard about the miracles that Jesus did in Jerusalem. So he's thinking, my son is sick, I better go get Jesus to heal him. So he did believe, it would seem, that he could heal his son. When he heard that Jesus was come out of Judea unto Galilee, he went unto him and besought him that he would come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Now you can imagine the desperation of the father, but what we see here is a level of faith, right? He did believe that Jesus could heal his son. But Jesus implies that his faith was incomplete. There was something about it, and this baffles, I think, all of us. What about this was wrong? Then said Jesus unto him. Now the word him is singular, right? He's talking directly to the official, to the nobleman. He said, except ye, which in English, we're not confusing. Well, we are confusing, right? English is a confusing language. The term for singular second person is you, right? If I'm talking to someone else, it's you. The same term is for plural. When I'm talking to a group, I say you. Now the South is a little more biblical, right? We say y'all, right? We have our own words that we can translate the Bible a little bit better in my home tongue, right? No, I'm kidding. In fact, Paul, I think he was a Southerner. He kept talking about how he reckons and things like that. But anyways, so I'm going to translate it into Southern talk. Then Jesus said unto him, except y'all see signs and wonders, y'all will not believe. And the question becomes, who is the y'all, right? Why did if he's talking to a specific person, why is he referring to a group of people? So we have to assume that whatever this group is, this person identifies with that group, or that this person is part of that group. So who is he referring to? Now, some people believe that he's referring to the Gentiles, right? That maybe this person was a Gentile. Now, I think if he was a Gentile, John would have made a bigger deal about that, because what happens later on is he puts faith in Jesus. Spoiler alert. But if a Gentile had put faith in Jesus that early in Jesus' ministry, and of course the Samaritans, they were kind of Gentiles. It's a very confusing thing. They were closer to Judaism than most, but they were still pretty different. But it's not clear that this person was a Gentile. It's never said that. We know that Herod's officials, who Herod would have been the tetrarch of this area, some of his officials lived in Tiberias. Yes, I believe that's the name of the city, which would have been pretty close to Capernaum, about 5 miles, I believe it was. So he may have lived in Capernaum near where the rest of them were living, and he may have been a royal official of King Herod, and excuse me. Herod did have some Gentile officials, but he also had Jewish officials. But I think there's good reasons to believe that Jesus was referring to the Jewish nation not receiving him. Because remember, let me go back a little bit. He said, for Jesus himself testified that a prophet had no honor except in his own country. Now, this is either referencing him leaving Judea or entering Galilee. So it's a little difficult to know. But if it is talking about him entering Galilee, it's hinting that the receiving that the Galileans gave Jesus wasn't as genuine as you might have thought. Because Jesus says unto him, except y'all see signs and wonders, y'all will not believe. Remember, the man did believe that Jesus could heal. So we have to assume that his frustration is with something very specific about this type of faith. We know that the Jewish people were always looking for signs. So when he says, you will not believe unless you see signs and wonders, then answered the Jews, this is in John 2:18, so this is before this story. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, what sign showest thou unto us, seeing thou doest these things? We also see throughout the book of John that the Jewish people, they didn't start believing in Jesus until after they saw signs. And a great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles. The word miracles there, it's the word signs. It's the same Greek word for signs, which he did on them that were diseased. And then in 1 Corinthians 1:22, this is Paul writing. He says, for the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. And we can see this play out in John chapter 4, where the Samaritans, they didn't need to see any signs, right? They believed Jesus because of his words. And then Jesus goes to Galilee, a place where the Jews would have been at, and suddenly he says, you guys won't believe me until you see signs and wonders. So I believe that Jesus is confronting the Jewish nation, or maybe even the Jews within Galilee. But we see a very similar thing happen later on in the book of John when Lazarus, the friend of Jesus, he's sick. And Mary and Martha, who are also friends of Jesus, they send for Jesus and they say, Lazarus is sick. And Jesus delays going to him until after he's already died. And by the time he gets there, you can imagine they're just distraught. And listen to what they say. Then when Mary was come where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. And this has caused different interpretations too. Why was Jesus troubled? Now, the 2 verses later, it goes on to say Jesus wept. And then the Jewish people who were there, who were mourning with Mary and Martha, they look at Jesus weeping and they interpret it as, look how much he loved Lazarus. And that may very well be true. But I'm going to give a little bit of another interpretation here, because we know Jesus was not ignorant about what was about to happen, right? He knew before he even got there, Lazarus was going to die and he was going to raise him from the dead. So the question is, why would he be weeping for Lazarus' death if he knew Lazarus was about to be alive again? Now, you could argue that he's not weeping for Lazarus, but rather he, as God, who is emotional, but also as man who is emotional, sees the emotions of those he loves and it affects him. And maybe that's true, but it's also possible that Jesus is frustrated. And I know that that's a different interpretation than most are used to, but we have to remember this is the last miracle that John records, and I think all the Gospels record, that Jesus did, and still there was something missing about their faith. And we go on to see, for example, in Matthew 17:17, someone else, he comes to Jesus for his son. I believe his son was demon-possessed, and he wanted them to be healed and stuff like that. And Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. Right? Jesus is becoming frustrated because he's been with them for so long, and they still are missing the point. Jesus is not just some great healer, and that's what they keep treating him as though if only he was there, right? Mary, just like and Martha as well, just like the nobleman, he said, Jesus, come to my son, heal him, or else he's gonna die. And Jesus says, unless you see signs and wonders, you won't believe. And now fast forward the clock to the final sign that Jesus is gonna do before his death and resurrection. And Jesus is looking at Mary and Martha, and he's saying, do you believe that that in the resurrection? And they're like, yeah, we believe that everyone's going to be resurrected one day, right? There was something missing, and I believe Jesus may have been frustrated and even saddened that here he was at the end of his ministry, and people still didn't understand. They were still missing something. They still had the faith that the nobleman showed when he called for Jesus to come heal his son. Let's see. The nobleman saith unto him, Sir, come down ere my child die, right? He's saying, Jesus, if you don't come down, my son is going to die, right? He's still, regardless of what Jesus just said, he's still fighting for his son's life. He still believes Jesus can heal him. And remember, Jesus just said, you won't believe unless you see signs and wonders. But then he seems to give the man a challenge or an opportunity to prove that that wasn't true, not for him at least. Jesus saith unto him, Go thy way, thy son liveth. And the man believed the word that Jesus had spoken unto him, and he went his way. You see, it doesn't say that Jesus had to prove to him that he could heal from a distance. It didn't say that he had to perform some miracle to him. It just said, Go, your son liveth. And he believed God. So just like the Samaritans before, he put faith not in what Jesus had done, but in what Jesus had said. He started to believe not in what Jesus could do, but in what Jesus said he could do, right? So he started putting faith not in the miracle, but in the word of Jesus. Let's see. And he went his way, and as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, Thy son liveth. Then inquired he of them the hour when he began to amend. And they said unto him, Yesterday at the 7th hour, which if the day starts at 6 a.m., so this would have been near 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At the 7th hour, the fever left him. So the father knew that it was at the same hour in the which Jesus said unto him, Thy son liveth. And himself believed, and his whole house. But here's the funny thing. It says after he sees the sign, he believes. But we saw that before he saw the sign, he believed. And this is my interpretation, if you will. The man had a faith in Jesus' ability to heal, right? He believed he was a great healer. But then his faith was challenged and grew to another level. It was no longer, this is just another great healer, but rather, I'm going to trust him at his word. He put faith in Jesus' word rather than seeing miracles. And then when his faith was, I suppose, rewarded in the sense that he saw the sign afterwards, it solidified what he had already believed, what he had already accepted as true, Jesus' word. So he himself put faith in Jesus, and not just him, but all of his house. So his faith went from Jesus is a great healer to Jesus is the Lord, right? He put his faith actually in Jesus. And one of the things that I find interesting, and I was going to talk about it, I thought it was going to be too long, and we may be making great time, I don't know. But I still think it would probably be too long, is we're going to talk about next week, is the healing of the centurion servant, which also happened at a distance, and it also happened in the same city. The city was smaller than Cheney, by the way, probably around 1,000 people in that city. And the question becomes, what happened first? This story where Jesus heals from a distance, or that story when Jesus heals from a distance? Because if this story happened, then I suppose it's okay because, well, let me explain it a little bit better. It's in my head. I just need to get it out, right? And we'll talk about it more next week. I don't want to spoil everything. But when the centurion showed a great level of faith in Jesus' ability to heal from a distance, it's not implied to be because the centurion saw Jesus heal from a distance before. It's implied that this is the first time this centurion has ever thought of this, or the first time that anyone's may have thought about this, and Jesus is amazed at his faith. So I would think that it would be unlikely that if Jesus was amazed at his faith, that the centurion already knew about this story, right? If the centurion already knew that Jesus had healed the son of a nobleman, a royal official, from a distance, then it's not much faith to believe he could do it again for his servant. But the fact that Jesus was amazed by it implies that the centurion likely did not know that story, and maybe it had not happened yet. Remember, John is only listing some of the miracles. He's not listing all of them. So let's imagine that maybe the centurion's son or servant was healed first. Now, this was not something that was done privately. If you read, I believe, Luke's gospel, Matthew kind of summarizes it. We're not going to talk about all that. We'll talk about it next week. But in Luke's gospel, he records the same story, and he talks about the centurion sending Jewish elders to Jesus and then sending more people to Jesus. So a lot of people knew about what was going on, and maybe, just maybe, the royal official heard this story too. But yet, instead of believing that Jesus could heal from a distance, he goes to Jesus and says, I need you to come to my son, right? I'm not taking chances. I've heard maybe about these miracles, but I'm not taking any chances. You need to come to my son. Now, there were other people who claimed to be great healers, but almost none of them claimed to heal from a distance. All of them believed that they had to be present for the healing. Even at the pool of Bethesda, where people believed they could be healed if the waters were stirred up, they believed you had to make contact with the water in order to be healed. So this nobleman, he may be coming to Jesus with the knowledge. Remember, John, he wrote his gospel likely last, and not only would he have been aware of the other three gospels, but he probably expected his readers to know the other three gospels. So when John talks about a authority in Capernaum coming to Jesus, asking him to heal, and Jesus heals from a distance, the readers of John would likely have associated that with the Roman centurion who did the exact same thing. From Capernaum, went to Jesus, asked him to heal somebody, and he healed from a distance. So it's likely that John is trying to emphasize that this centurion, if they did know the story, the centurion showed a level of faith that the nobleman did not. The nobleman viewed Jesus as another healer. The centurion viewed Jesus as a God, right? A God who had authority to heal even when he wasn't even around. So it's possible that the royal official was aware of the story, but in spite of it, Jesus says, you won't even believe it, right? You have to see the signs and the wonders before the people will believe. But the person's faith, it does grow. It goes from, I believe Jesus is a great healer, to I believe Jesus' word, to I believe in Jesus. Does that make sense? And John is not against signs and wonders. That's why he's writing his book, right? He's writing about all these signs to prove to people that Jesus is who he says he is. But he wants people to believe not in what Jesus can do for them, but in who Jesus is, right? Jesus is not just someone who can heal you. Jesus is the Savior of the world, which is what he emphasized in the story of the Samaritan. All right, everyone should trust in Jesus, not in his abilities, for these three reasons. The official believed Jesus could heal. The official's faith was incomplete. The official's faith grew. You see, it's interesting that this was a royal official. The word in Greek is the same word for royalty, and we know that he probably wasn't actual royalty, so he was an official. But here, John is describing someone who serves an earthly king going to Jesus, right? He went from serving an earthly king to serving the King of Kings. He went from seeking a healer to finding a God. And so often we look at Jesus or God as though they're just genies in the bottle, right? Or genies in a lamp, I guess. And there may be genies in bottles. I don't think genies exist. But anyways, genies in lamps, where they're just there to serve us. They're just there to do what we want. We trust that God can heal our infirmities. We trust that God can help us with our grades if you're in school. We trust that God can help us with our work. But do we trust God even when he challenges us, right? It would have been very easy for Jesus to just say, okay, I'll come down and heal your son. In fact, in the story of the centurion, when they sent for Jesus, Jesus was on his way to go to the servant to heal him. But we'll talk about it next week. I don't want to get into it. It's a nice story. Jesus could have healed the nobleman's son without ever saying anything about his faith being incomplete or the faith of his group being incomplete. But instead, he challenges him. He puts him in a position where he has to trust Jesus. And have you ever been in a position where you prayed for something very earnestly, believing that God could do it, but when he didn't, it kind of caused like, oh, I don't know what to do? Or did you trust him even when he didn't do what you wanted him to do? I often say that I have complete trust in God. I'm just scared, right? Scared that he won't do what I want, right? I believe he can do whatever he wants, but I'm scared he won't always do what I want. Miss Lily and I, we've feel as though God may be calling us to the mission field, and I didn't want to get married. She convinced me. Don't let her fool you. Now, I did want to marry her. I'm saying I didn't want to get... That's right. She was very persuasive, okay? But anyways, I was dead set. I wasn't getting married, and that was before I met her, and she knocked me off my feet and just carried me around in her heart or something. But I was convinced I'm not getting married, and the reason for it was I felt like if I'm going to go to the mission field and if I'm going to go, I want to go somewhere dangerous, somewhere where no one else is willing to go, and I don't trust God to protect my wife. Isn't that sad? I hate to say I don't trust God to protect me. I know he can protect me. You remember the story of the three friends of Daniel who's in the fiery furnace? They said, we know God can protect us, but even if he doesn't. And I had perhaps that level of faith in the sense that I believed I was willing to go and sacrifice my life if need be, but not my wife's life, right? So I struggled with that. And I think that's something we all struggle with. We trust God that God can, but we don't always trust when God doesn't. Does that make sense? And I think that's what Jesus was trying. And by the way, my faith is growing, right? I still don't want you to die. But my faith is growing, and I understand that when circumstances happen in my life that I don't understand, God's still working, and I can trust him in that. And that's what the royal official, that's the position that he was put in. He grew up in a society where there were people who claimed to be healers, people who claimed that they could come to your house and heal whatever infirmities you have. But he probably had never heard of someone who could heal from a distance. And here he is pleading with Jesus, not for his life, but for the life of his son, saying, if you come, my son will live, but if you don't, my son's going to die. And Jesus says, well, he doesn't say it literally, but figuratively, he says, trust me. And he does. He puts his trust in Jesus, and he goes home to find that trust was well placed. And I want to encourage you, when you're going through times in your life where you're begging God for something and he doesn't give it to you, trust him. He's trying to grow your faith. Does that make sense? Makes sense in my head. I just don't know if it came out right. All right, let's go ahead and pray. Dear Lord, I want to thank you for this day. Lord, I don't always like stepping out into the waters like Peter did. We don't always like taking that leap of faith, especially when it comes to people we love. I can only imagine if that official had heard the story of you healing from a distance with the centurion servant, that he just didn't want to take any chances, Lord. Lord, I pray that we would continue to trust that you can do things, but we would trust even when you choose not to do what we want you to do. I pray that through those experiences, our faith would grow, not crumble. Lord, I pray that you give us the wisdom that we need to follow you and the strength to do it. Lord, we lean on you for everything. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.